Hello, everyone. Today we will be having a course on Perreo Combativo, which is where disability justice meets reggaeton. You may be asking yourself, what in earth does disability justice have to do with reggaeton? Well, today we're going to start that conversation, unpack a few concepts, and hopefully start a journey where you might be starting to analyze the role that disability justice has in every aspect of life. Before doing so, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Isabella Ramirez de Arellano. I also have a nickname of Risa. I consider myself a disabled Boricua activist. For those who don't know, Boricua is the name of the people who come from Boriquen. Boriquen is the pre-colonial name for the island of Puerto Rico. Um, I'm also a researcher. I like to focus my work through a anti-imperial queer disability justice lens. Also, given my formal studies, I also include aspects of psychology, public health, as well as media studies and production. Um, I consider myself disabled, as mentioned, and I've been disabled since birth. However, in 2020, after a COVID infection, I had a stroke, and since then, my disabilities have become far more pronounced. As a result of that, I started my own organization called Expert of Me, where the focus is really about how self expertise is meeting collective liberation. We can't build a world that is free from these systems of oppression without unpacking how these systems of oppression live within inside of us. So part of that also includes taking agency of our own knowledge of what we know about ourselves and the world. And then also applying that with theory to ensure that it's not just our thoughts, but it's being met with the collective knowledge and ancestral ways of thinking. I'm also an organizer with the Diaspora Palante Collective, which is a diaspora organization for Puerto Ricans and allies working towards the liberation of our island as we are a colony of the United States. We may be considered a part of it by many, but we consider it within the organization and myself as being occupied. In addition to that, I'm also a global disability advisor for Billion Strong. Billion Strong is a global disability movement, organization, collective, so to speak. We're working on creating an international perspective on disability, as I will discuss later on, but formally known, which is to say that there are probably far more people included that are not accounted for in statistics. However, 16% of the global population is in fact disabled. So it's important that we create a global movement rather than an isolated one. And most recently, I've joined the Actors Council at 7 Billion Presidents, and this is a anti-capitalist organization working on partnering with companies and people to once again build a world that is not being made just for the 1%, but it's the people working for the people and creating a better world. And I hope we can do that together. So to get us started, I want to show a contrast between what it can be like to be disabled and like reggaeton or be a reggaetonera or reggaetonero. So to our left, we see a lady with canes who's at a concert, and she somewhat provocatively has the title of Who Said You Can't Be Disabled and dance reggaeton. This is exactly right. I think a lot of the times people think that there's only one type of person that can enjoy reggaeton. And this is also reflected in the lyrics and the entire environment of the genre, which we will get into later. While it's great that this individual was able to access this venue, there's a lot of times where that is not the case, even if the person who's performing is the disabled person. This is the case for the reggaetonero El Valiente. This is Brian Amastia, and he had survived 56 major surgeries, and he was planned to perform at Calle Ocho. Unfortunately, his entire performance got canceled as a result of there not being accessibility options in the venue. There wasn't a ramp. However, Valiente offered to bring his own ramp, He was met with resistance and told it's a fire hazard, and the entire venue has refused to work forward with the artist, and therefore he has not been able to perform at this event. So while it's great that the lady on the left was able to attend, we need to keep in mind that disability doesn't just look one way. It is incredibly diverse. We'll get into this further in the presentation. However, one of the principles of working within disability justice is understanding a cross movement and cross disability solidarity. We need to understand that our own experiences of disability do not speak for every single person's experience. And this was perfectly encapsulated also by reggaetonera Precious Perez. And this was a preview of Precious Perez's new music. And the way that she has put what I was just describing is that disability is not one size fits all. It's incredibly diverse. Even within one single person, your experience of your own disability varies from day to day, year to year, week to week, hour to hour. So there's no way for us to universalize these experiences, which is another aspect that we need to keep in mind when going forward in this conversation. I do want to take a moment and highlight Precious Perez. She is an upcoming reggaetonera. She's blind, and in this video here, you see a preview of the new song, No Me Hizo Falta Verte. And this came as a result of her husband also being blind. And oftentimes she is met with almost shock from people that she, a blind woman, would marry another blind man, because before they know this, she's told, oh, well, at least at the end of the day, your husband can help you with things. There's a lot of assumptions being made in that for a variety of reasons, but I do want to focus on the aspect of the focus of Perez's song. In the song, she's talking about the fact that neither of them needed to see each other to know that that love is real. I want to highlight this not only to highlight the genius of her music, but it's also to understand that the way that disabled people interact with each other is its own culture. We need to understand disability not just as a individual experience, even though, as I just mentioned, it is very different from person to person. We also have to understand it as a greater culture, a greater picture of things. And being able to understand it as a greater picture of things means understanding how we relate to one another, the culture that we create, the way that we find love, the way that we find joy, the way that we find friendship, transcends what is being normalized in able-bodied culture. Now I would like to talk to you about different models of disability. Given what I just shared about Perez and the different experiences with venue access, it's important that we have a similar framework, at least an understanding of how we're conceptualizing these things. So onto our left, we see an image of a woman in a wheelchair in front of a bunch of different steps. And the creator of this beautifully illustrated the different models here. So first we have the medical model. And this is to say that your condition is the problem. It is because you have XYZ that your life is difficult. It is only because of you and your own experience of this diagnosis. It's also important to understand that within the medical model, there's a level of biocertification involved. Biocertification is to say that one is only considered disabled once you have been diagnosed or officially told by a professional. I'm sure many of you who may be listening have experienced maybe even a moment of disability. Maybe you didn't get that told by a doctor, but you had difficulties completing tasks one way or another. That doesn't change how you experienced those moments of disability, but within a medical model, someone would tell you, no, you're not disabled. However, in a functional model, that would be the understanding that you are functionally disabled if you're unable to complete a certain task. As seen in the graphic here, functional disability would mean your inability to climb the stairs is the problem. This is different from a medical model in the sense that while, yes, somebody may not be able to functionally do something due to their medical reason, the functional moves slightly more away from biocertification and towards a analysis of what that person's interaction with the world is like, from their own personal perspective and their own functionality. Whereas the social model, here, as it says, is the stairs are the problem. In the social model, it's not to say that somebody doesn't have functional limitations, but it is to say that those functional limitations are not the issue, but something to be addressed in the way that our social environment is programmed and constructed. So instead of there being stairs, if there was a ramp or a elevator, or generally speaking, a flat venue, then the experience of someone's disability is not in any type of way a limitation. Now moving to a transnational model. This is a new model being proposed by a researcher, Kasemi. And in this paper, she's talking about the ways that disability is a result of violence. This is an addition to the models of disability that I have just discussed. So in this transnational model, there are two aspects of violence being proposed or discussed. There's the process, which is, as it says here, poverty, exploitation, war, environmental destruction. And then there's relational violence, which is via capitalism, nationalism, theocracy, imperialism. Arguably, the process is a result of the relation. For example, poverty isn't being experienced because somebody isn't good with money. Somebody is experiencing poverty because of the way the capitalist system is set up, that people, regardless of how much they work, regardless of the energy and production being put in, you're never going to reach the status of a millionaire, billionaire, because of the status quo and the way that the systems are set up. War, for example, is another result of imperialism. As we see in Sudan, Palestine, and beyond, these these are genocides, but these are all coming through the process of imperialism, the relational aspect of country to country and country to people. And in these ways, it leads to disability. So if somebody is, in a war zone or experiencing genocide and their limbs, they have limb loss, this is, of course, a form of disability. This also includes things like psychiatric disabilities that are being experienced from these circumstances. I think it's really important to understand this model of disability, particularly when we're discussing reggaeton and disability. But before I want to get into crossing over these two intersections, I want to first explain to you the different principles of disability justice, and then also a brief overview of disability, including a definition of ableism. After that, that's when we'll start to get into resistance and disability justice in the realm of reggaeton. So now moving on to the principles of disability justice. There are 10 principles. First, we will start off with intersectionality, and none of these are in any particular order. This was first proposed and introduced by feminist theorist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and this was used to describe the experiences of Black women who experience both racism, sexism, in very specific ways. It's also very important for us to understand this in a large scale. So for this circumstance, we'll be talking about disability, but we're not only disabled, we're also coming from a specific experience of race, class, sexuality, age, religious background, geographical location, immigration status, and more. And this is important in understanding why some people may experience greater levels of oppression and more severe consequences due to their intersecting identities. Then we'll be moving on to the second principle of leadership of those most impacted. So when we talk about ableism, racism, sexism, transmisogyny, colonization, all of these type of things, including police violence, we're not just looking to the ivory towers. We're not just looking to the big institutions like the UN. We need to be highlighting and looking at the people who are in fact impacted at the front lines. And when I say front lines, I'm not literally talking about people who are, you know, face to face with these things. This very much includes the people who are stuck at home. And the reason why we want to center the leadership of those most impacted is not just from a, um, feel good perspective. This is also deeply, deeply strategic. Somebody who is at the forefront and most impacted by these various systems of oppression are going to have an understanding of the world that people who are more privileged cannot have. This is a type of experience that is learned. This is a type of knowledge that is learned through experience. And these are survival skills that are necessary in our fight for creating a more just world. And so moving on from that, we then go on to anti-capitalist politics. So capitalism depends on wealth accumulation for some, the white ruling class, at the expense of others, and encourages competition as a means of survival. The nature of our disabled body minds means that we resist conforming to normative levels of productivity in a capitalist culture, and our labor is often invisible to a system that defines labor by able-bodied, white supremacist, gender-normative standards. Our worth is not dependent on what and how much we can produce. This is incredibly important to disability justice because part of why we are so disenfranchised within the capitalist system is because we inherently challenge it. We lean on each other, which is interdependence, which I will get to in a moment, which is inherently contradictory to capitalism, which is incredibly individualistic. It's very me, self-centered. Whereas in disability, it is required for survival that we depend on each other. And this should be the case for everybody, not just disabled people, because prior to colonization, that is exactly how we lived. We all had a village. Now we just outsource it with different services, and that's only available to those who have the privilege of accessing these things. Since I mentioned interdependence, I will explain that now as well. So, as I mentioned, before the massive colonial project of Western European expansion, we understood the nature of independence within our communities. We see the liberation of all living systems in the land as integral to the liberation of our own communities, as we all share one planet. We work to meet each other's needs as we build toward liberation without always reaching for state solutions which inevitably extend state control further into our lives. This is incredibly important because while somebody may say, oh, well, what if I don't have people? Then you have to rely on state programs. This is in fact by design. These type of programs are highly linked to surveillance. For the longest time, Lockheed Martin has actually had a oversight into disability SSDI. So when we consider the way that the state offers help, which is in quotations, we need to understand the repercussions and who it's impacting the most, which again goes back to leaning on their leadership. Then we will move on to cross-movement solidarity. So what this is basically saying is that we cannot have a one-issue way of moving forward in our lives. We don't live one-issue lives. That's just the way that it is. That goes back to intersectionality. So we need to be creating a movement that connects racial justice, reproductive justice, queer and trans liberation, prison abolition, environmental justice, anti-police violence, deaf activism, pet liberation. We need to understand that the only path forward is integration. Capitalism thrives on separating us, not just from ourselves, but from each other, from land. Because when we are not united, we are far more controllable. So creating cross-movement solidarity, in fact, leans very heavily into interdependence in that way. And if we recognize our wholeness, which is another principle of disability justice, this becomes increasingly easier to do. Once we become integrated with our dignity as human beings by the virtue of just existing, it is easier to understand that we cannot be defined by the systems that come down on us. Each person is full of history, life experiences, has internal experiences that are composed of our own thoughts, sensations, emotion, sexual fantasies, perceptions, quirks. It's a whole party. We're fascinating beings, and we need to sit with that and accept that so that we can create life and world that holds space for all of that. Because our current world actively ensures that we have to make ourselves small. We cut ourselves short so that we can fit into the agenda. But that's not sustainable, which goes on to our next principle. Sustainability. We need to learn how to pace ourselves individually and collectively so that we can create a long-term vision for long-term collective liberation. What this also involves is understanding that we're also not just fighting a class war, we are also fighting a culture war. It is easy to fall into a trap of saying it's class war and nothing else. While yes, we need to unify on it's the majority of people versus the 1%, we also need to understand a intercultural perspective to our sustainable organizing. If we fail to understand, for example, that disabled people have our own culture, we will not be able to bridge these gaps and create cross-movement organizing. And going further now into talking about collective liberation, as I just said, we need to move together as people with mixed abilities, being multiracial, multigendered, mixed class, across the sexual spectrum, where absolutely no body, mind, spirit is left out of the picture. It is important that we understand that our collective liberation hinges on it being collective. We cannot liberate as individuals. We need to liberate as a collective, as a people. It is we, not I. And finally, I will also discuss a commitment to cross-disability solidarity, which is incredibly important to our collective liberation. As mentioned, disability is not just a monolithic experience. It is incredibly diverse in one person and across the spectrum of what it means to be disabled. So we have to honor and value the insights of all of our community members, not putting one above the other, while of course still centering those most impacted. We need to understand and include the chronically ill and disabled, for example, by masking. We need to include the deaf and hard of hearing by ensuring that we have microphones, closed captioning, ASL. We need to include blind people by ensuring that we have enough room for the sticks to move around. We need to have Braille present. We need to be careful not to have perfume for those who are sensitive to smell. I'm sure I'm starting to create a picture in your mind. And this is the whole point of disability justice. It's to create a very tangible way of looking at the world and organizing for a better world. We have to honor also the longstanding legacies of resilience and resistance, which is an inheritance of all of us from all of our ancestors. This is not new knowledge. This is a collaboration of many different fantastic disabled people coming together over the years to finally come up with principles of disability justice as created by Patty Byrne, Sins Invalid. I would like to now do a brief little overview of disability as we're moving more closer to Reggaeton. So approximately 1/3 of Boricuas are disabled. There's varying search results on this and studies on this. It really depends on who's doing the research and why. And that's something that I think is also relevant to the conversation, but for another time. Understanding that approximately 1/3 of Boricuas are disabled is important when we're talking about something like reggaeton, which is very, very tied to our culture. As mentioned before, 16% of the global population is disabled. And this is likely an undercount, but that's just what we're going to be working with for now. As I also mentioned, no, I hadn't mentioned this actually. What I want to add is that while, let's say, the number that we're working with is 16%, it's also relevant to understand that anyone and everyone can and will become disabled at any point in their life. If you do not experience disability in your life, I will just be so direct to say that means you have died too soon. To be disabled is to be human. To be human is to become disabled. To be disabled is completely morally neutral. There is nothing bad, good, anything about being disabled. It just is. And that doesn't minimize the wonders and beauty of being disabled, because I think a lot of the time, disability is being understood as this tragic misfortune. But if you speak to disabled people that are particularly rooted in disability justice, you will experience a level of joy and pride of disability that I can not really put into words and just hope that you can experience. Disability justice also came out of experiencing enormous amounts of ableism. And this is a definition created by Talila Lewis, which I will read to you now. Ableism is a system of assigning is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. These systemic oppressions lead to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, living place, health, quote unquote, and wellness, also in quotes, and or their ability to satisfactorily produce and reproduce, and quote unquote, excel and behave. It is very important to understand that you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism, because it is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy. If you fall under or out of this idea of normalcy for whatever reason, without being disabled, you can still experience ableism. This is also important to understand why ableism and anti-Blackness are incredibly tied by the hip, which will come through when we're talking about Reggaeton as well. Part of why I wanted to create this lesson in talking about disability and Reggaeton is because I see both of these things as sites of resistance. They're sites of resistance to various different things. So principally, it is a resistance to imperialism, because imperialism will fall over into these other categories. So understanding the origins of reggaeton, being an underground scene, this was during a time period of incredible surveillance, suppression, and it was a means of the people expressing themselves. This was also a way of resisting the intercultural struggles, because there was a culture of conservatism, being conservative, purity culture, because this is an imported idea by colonialism. Prior to colonialism, Indigenous people lived freely, openly, without these levels of judgment of how one should show up. Nudity wasn't seen as this obscene sexual thing. It was just an understanding of a way of showing up in our bodies. However, we're living in a colonial world, and that means that we're also fighting internal struggles, wars that go beyond weaponry, but it's an intellectual, spiritual struggle. So when people are coming at people with a Puritan perspective, it's important to understand that this may not be a perspective that they would have without colonialism. Part of the role that Puritan or purity culture has is to control the people. And who benefits from control? Imperial nations. These are nations of tyranny, control over the body, mind, spirit, and which is why in reggaeton they talk about sex very often. It is a way of saying, you cannot control me. I want to experience this level of pleasure. And this is why I went into the underground, understanding that they're also talking about violence. This violence is also coming from imperialism. In an inequitable world, we are creating violence. Violence is not something that is innate to human beings, but it is a result of the systems, the structure of the systems that we live under. If people are forced to survive, it will change their way of relating to one another, leading to violence. And this is a theme that often comes up in music, talking about being un bichote, a gangster. Importantly, as discussed prior about the transnational model of disability, violence is a leading factor to disability, which is also, again, once again, tied to imperialism. However, in music of reggaeton, this is a theme that is very, very left out, which we will talk about in a moment. I want to move on to understanding anti-indigeneity as a point of resistance between both disability and reggaeton. So because this is a type of music made by the people for the people, this is leaning more on indigenous frames of thinking. This is an understanding of reclamation, of taking life by the horns and singing what you want to talk about, not what culture and society is telling you is acceptable. And I want to connect this to disability because ableism is deeply tied to anti-indigeneity. So if there's this type of music that we're not favoring, that is from the people, by the people, this is anti-indigenous. The same way that ableism is anti-indigenous is that it is a controlling of the way that we express ourselves in our bodies. It's the way that our bodies exist. If music is being controlled, our bodies are being controlled. If our bodies are being controlled, that is to say, this is only a certain type of body, mind, spirit that is acceptable. Arguably, this falls under ableism as well, given the definition I just gave you before. Now I want to move on to specifically a sort of mind map of creating the overlaps between disability justice and reggaeton. At the top, I wanted to put imperialism as this impacts everything from below. I put racial hierarchy on the bottom because this is the baseline of everything that shows up above. So let's go down the line. How does joy show up in reggaeton as well as disability? Reggaeton obviously is exciting, it's fun, we're all perreando, we're twerking. As a means of expressing ourselves, a means of feeling our bodies, being in movement, being in community. Whereas in disability, our joy is experienced in various types of ways. We experience joy in the simple things. Once I became more disabled, I experienced joy just through seeing a ray of sunlight hit my window. This is not necessarily something I would have really held on to prior to becoming to the rate of disability that I did. Another way that disabled people are finding joy is obviously through music. It allows us to sit with our bodies sometimes in a way that isn't as painful. Because for me personally, the ways that my disability shows up is in a lot of chronic pain. So the way that I like to escape this is also by dancing. Every morning I put some type of music on, very often reggaeton, and to the best of my abilities, I'm dancing around to move through the stress and connect back with my body. But going back to the first slide where I show how people are not even allowed into venues because of inaccess, it's important that we start to bridge these worlds together so that disabled people can experience their joy in the environments that they are born out of with people who also enjoy this type of music. As we just talked about, violence, of course, shows up as a predisposing factor to disability. And it's also showing up in reggaeton in various ways through like interpersonal violence. And then there's also a type of resistance reggaeton that speaks of the violence of imperialism, for example. Going on to racial hierarchy and violence, it's important to see how Black and brown bodies are experiencing a far greater level of violence than white and light-skinned bodies. This then further increases when we understand racial hierarchy with disability as well. And this brings me also back to the definition of ableism, as it's deeply also tied with racism. When we talk about reggaeton, there's a very specific type of person being discussed when we're talking about the beauty standards within this music, which is also a type of violence, in my opinion. If we're only talking about one type of person, one type of beauty, this is violent to other types of body, mind, spirits. A lot of times there's lyrics that are quite literally pointing out that there's a song by Anuel where he says that he's cheating on a better woman and mentions that she's blanquita, that she's a little white lady. Um, while these lyrics don't necessarily inherently say that this person is able-bodied, it is clear that we're not picturing a disabled person of any kind, whether it's somebody who's deaf, somebody who is in a wheelchair, somebody who's blind. This is particularly clear when you start looking at lyrics that focus on the way that their body looks, the way that their hair flows, the way that they look at them. These are all elements of quote unquote health, um, where disability is fleeting in the background, despite its, inherent tie to multiple different themes being discussed. When we're going back to imperialism and being an occupied people as Boricuas, this is also disabling. To be occupied is disabling. So I think it's important that the music industry starts to pick up on understanding who's part of our people, who are we talking to, and why, what informs these thoughts. Um, so please also lean on disabled artists like Precious Perez, who's breaking through these norms of understanding of, pure sexuality, pure sensuality of the white, able-bodied, wealthy person. And we can connect this also to assistance because being able to show up just as yourself and claiming yourself as beautiful in a world that wants you to be ugly, that's an immediate way of claiming oneself and resisting being narrated for, and instead narrating with oneself and society and others, which is what reggaeton offers. It's a form of narration, it's a form of describing, storytelling, sharing one's experience and understanding of the world. If our understanding of the world is entirely entrenched by imperial and colonized ways of thinking, we are going to continue to reproduce a world that does not include us. Because even if the people who are singing these things are included in their various definitions of beauty and desirability, they're creating an environment where it is completely acceptable and dependent on just our supposed personal views of beauty. I say supposed because I challenge the notion that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I propose that it is there's been a framework applied to us in the way that we understand beauty. And we see beauty through a lens of, colonialism. We see beauty through a lens of racism. We see beauty through the lens of ableism. So being able to reclaim our own identity is to reject this inherited storytelling by imperialism. So reggaeton needs to take on the role of storytelling for us, for the people, including everybody. Otherwise, we're creating our own environment of rejection. So now I ask for your opinions for your homework. Based off of the mapping I just shared, what could be added? What do you think is something that may be missing that I didn't consider? I would like to hear your thoughts on why you added those things. Next, I would like you to answer the question, in what ways beauty, reggaeton, and disability justice are related, analyze and explain. Though I just gave a overview of the ways that these things intersect, I want to know your personal experience and understanding of beauty. I want to understand how you see these things intersect in addition to what I just shared. And lastly, I want you to examine in what ways ableism presents itself in reggaeton. So not just through the topics of desirability and sexuality, but also through things like venue access, or, for example, ... Please let me know your thoughts. If you do have any questions, my email will be on the first slide as well as attached in the lesson. post. So thank you so much. And I look forward to your homework assignments and hearing your wonderful ideas.